Now we are going to move on to discussing a method that has less reliability in court, polygraphs. The modern polygraph has been used in some form or another for nearly a century, and much cruder versions of its components existed as far back as 300 BCE. For example, in Arabia, suspects were asked to lick a hot iron. If their tongue did not blister, they were judged to be telling the truth. In ancient China, suspects were asked to take a mouthful of rice. It was assumed that those who were guilty would have a dry mouth and would not be able to spit all the rice out on command, as it would be stuck on their tongue. The underlying principle for both of these methods is that a nervous or tense person, presumably the one who is lying, has less saliva, resulting in a dry mouth and tongue, and thus likely to have their tongue burned or be unable to spit out rice or bread. In India, a donkey's tail was covered with mud or soot. Thus, it became the practice to place a donkey in a dark tent with a suspected liar. That individual was then told to pull the donkey's tail, and if the donkey did not bray, that meant the suspect was innocent. If the suspect exited the tent with clean hands, it was assumed that he or she had not pulled the tail out of fear of being found out. The irony here is that the donkey would bray in a dark tent if its tail were pulled as well. So both routes would end up in someone being declared guilty. Lastly, in colonial America, those suspected of being witches were tied to a board and dunked in a pond of water. If they floated, they were deemed a witch and executed. If they didn't float, they were proved not to be a witch, but then they would most likely drown. So again, double-edged sword for each case. With regard to the development of modern techniques, in 1878, the Italian physiologist Angelo Mosso used a plumosograph in his research on emotion and fear in subjects undergoing questioning. This instrument was designed to measure changes in volume within an organ or the whole body. Although not for the purpose of lie detection, Sir James Mackenzie constructed the first clinical polygraph in 1892. He used this for medical examinations with the capabilities to simultaneously record undulated line tracings of the vascular pulses. It is important to note that until the end of the 19th century, no measuring device for the detection of deception had ever been used. The first scientific instrument came in 1895 when Italian physician, psychiatrist, and pioneer criminologist Cesare Lombroso modified the hydropomograph and used it to measure the physiological changes that occurred in a crime suspect's blood pressure and pulse rate during a police investigation. In 1914, Italian psychologist Vittorio Benussi invented a method to calculate the quotient of the inhalation to exhalation time as a means of verifying the truth and detecting deception in a subject. He used a pneumograph which recorded breathing patterns. And eventually, in 1915, William Marston created the earliest form of what we now call a lie detector. Modern definitions of polygraph define it as an instrument that simultaneously records changes in physiological processes such as heartbeat, blood pressure, respiration, and electrical resistance, such as galvanic skin response. The underlying theory of the polygraph is that when people lie, they also get measurably nervous about lying, which causes physiological changes that we assume we can measure. When it comes to measuring those responses, There are three basic approaches. The first approach is the control question test, or the CQT, which is also referred to as the relevant or irrelevant technique. This approach compares the physiological response to relevant questions about the crime with the response to questions relating to possible prior misdeeds. For example, a question in a case involving alleged child sexual abuse. Did you insert your finger in Susan's vagina? With irrelevant questions covering inconsequential topics for which the correct answer was readily apparent. Is today Tuesday? This technique is seldom used in forensic settings because even innocent people are more reactive to the threatening accusation contained in the relevant question than to the innocuous content covered by the irrelevant question. The CQT is actually more of a collection of procedures that have in common the inclusion of relevant and control questions than it is a single test. Basically, it is a polygraph-assisted interview during which the examiner must convince the subject that the control questions are just as important as the relevant questions. This is accomplished by getting the subject to agree that the kind of person likely to commit the particular crime would also be likely to engage in other types of misbehavior, such as deceiving the police. Without ever making a distinction between the control and relevant questions, the examiner then introduces possible control questions that the subject also agrees are reasonably worded and can be answered unambiguously. For example, have you ever lied to a person in a position of authority? Because the examiner admonishes the subject that the test will only work if the subject is completely truthful, many subjects, when confronted with a control question like this, will indicate that they have in fact lied to an authority figure, for example, to a parent or a teacher. At this point, the control question is rewarded so that it begins with this question. Other than what you have told me about, have you ever lied to a person in a position of authority? If the subject says yes, then the examiner leads the subject to believe that making such admissions is somewhat incriminating, thereby hoping that the subject will refrain from revealing any additional misdeeds. The second approach is the directed lie test, or DLT. This approach tries to detect lying by comparing physiological responses when the subject is told to deliberately lie to responses when they tell the truth. The third approach is the guilty knowledge test, or GKT. This approach compares physiological responses to multiple choice type questions about the crime, one choice of which contains only information the crime investigators and the criminal would know about. In a typical GKT, a suspect is exposed to guilty knowledge information as well as other types of information with similar thematic content. If pictures of weapons are flashed on a computer screen, the perpetrator would be expected to recognize the weapon used in the crime, and the picture of this weapon, when processed by the brain, is supposed to produce a recognition response evident in autonomic nervous system reactivity and cerebral electrical responses. This technique actually does have a legitimate scientific foundation as it is based on brain processes underlying memory. But pre-trial publicity may also lead to those other than the perpetrator knowing details about the crime. Other influencing factors are a witness or accomplice may have the same knowledge of the crime, and the suspect needs to have good memory for the crime scene. When it is allowed in court, jurors often find polygraph evidence to be convincing, and if it is presented with expert testimony that claims high accuracy rates for the polygraph, the percent of jurors that find the defendant guilty increase dramatically.
It might be the cheeks flushing with embarrassment or a voice choking with emotion. Our physical reactions can reveal what we truly feel. And some think they can show when someone's lying. Typically, when a person tells a lie, they begin to sweat. I'm sure we've all seen the 1940s and 50s interrogation movies where the person in the hot seat has a sweaty brow or a sweaty upper lip, or perhaps sweat dripping down from their sideburns. And if you lean forward in the chair, put your arms out in front of you like you're going to dive into a swimming pool, this will around your stomach. Jack Tremarco uses physical sensations to probe for truth. His primary tool? The lie detector, or polygraph. This cuff is just like the doctor. Polygraph works very similar to any other biofeedback instrument. It simply records deviations from a person's physiological norm, such as someone's blood pressure going up and then coming back down, or perhaps a decrease or an increase in pulse rate or sweat gland activity. Are you sometimes known as Polly? Yes. A polygraph examiner knows what to look for when questioning someone. Do you intend to be completely truthful with me? Yes. Any deviation from normal could signal deception. Our body can give us away. And are you sure that I will try to trick you? Yes. We may think we're being cool, but when we're stressed, our network of nerves starts to prepare our body for action, as if it's under attack. It's a response that harks back to our ancient ancestors. Fight or flight. It starts by triggering your stress hormone, adrenaline. Your heart rate increases to pump more blood to your muscles, as if you were about to go into battle. Your breathing deepens as vital oxygen reaches your muscles, and you begin to sweat. The body cools so that you won't overheat when rushed into action. The brain won't let us stop this survival strategy. These basic nervous functions are automatic. That's why a polygraph can often uncover a liar.
The world is full of lies, and deception is an essential lubricant of social interaction. If you think about your favorite television show or book, chances are that one of the key plot elements is a lie told by one of the main characters. From an evolutionary perspective, lying is adaptive. That is, it serves a useful function that promotes survival. Lying is not only ubiquitous, but it is also multifaceted. The varied words for deception convey something about its complexity. We can lie, mislead, misinform, trick, fake, betray, fool, cheat, con, confabulate, delude, dupe, dissemble, deceive, distort, fabricate, exaggerate, pretend, distort, feign, falsify, or misrepresent. We can be inauthentic, disingenuous, or downright mendacious. Each of these words conveys a slightly different shade of meaning, though all imply a bending or violation of the truth. In addition, there are lies of commission, where you say something that is not true, and lies of omission, where you leave out something crucial. There are well-rehearsed lies and spontaneous lies. There are lies told to help others, lies told to hurt others, or to help ourselves at the expense of others. Bella DePaulo, a well-known expert on lying and lie detection, puts it this way: lying is just so ordinary, so much a part of our everyday lives and everyday conversations that we hardly notice it, and in many cases, it would be more difficult, challenging, and stressful for people to tell the truth than to lie. So how do we tell when others are lying? The success of a polygraph depends on the skills of the examiners in developing questions, as well as their questioning skills and ability to read the polygraph results. In addition, some individuals are very emotional and reactive, regardless of their guilt or innocence, while others, such as career criminals and psychopaths, show no reactivity even when lying. For the polygraph to be effective, it is essential that the person being questioned believes that the lie detector really works. This effect can sometimes be achieved by duping the suspect, having him or her tell what the person administering the polygraph knows to be a lie, and then declaring what the polygraph has detected that a lie is being told. There is no standardization of the content of questions. Creating control items as well as relevant items of equal arousal is difficult, and there are no set criteria for the scoring of the polygraphs. Psychological research has examined human lie detection abilities in hundreds of studies. In most of these studies, participants view videotapes of people either telling the truth or a lie. Because there are only two choices, lie or truth, the chance rate of accuracy is 50% correct by simply flipping a coin and using a rule such as heads, it's a lie, tails, it's the truth. In 2006, some researchers statistically synthesized the results from 384 research studies that tested lie detecting powers of more than 24,000 people. Their research findings were as follows. People can do better than chance in distinguishing truth from lies, but not by much. The overall rate of accuracy was 54%. When liars had time to plan out and rehearse their lies, as is almost always the case in legal settings, their lies were slightly harder to detect. And if observers were able to compare the same person lying and telling the truth, they were slightly better able to recognize the lie. However, these advantageous or disadvantageous conditions only move accuracy rates up or down by 2%. So overall, research shows us that even trained professionals are slightly better than chance, but not by much, only 54%. This should shake our faith in the ability of jurors and judges to tell whether a witness is lying, because clearly there is no Pinocchio response, no dead giveaway, no obvious visible signal that someone is telling a lie. But what about these interrogators that are trained to read verbal and nonverbal behavior, such as police officers? The problem is that their training may wrongly increase confidence in lie detection skills, even though it may not increase the ability to differentiate truth from deception. Unfortunately, the behavioral cues investigators are taught to focus on, such as crossing legs, shifting and fidgeting, grooming gestures, avoiding eye contact, are flawed indicators of deception. These cues are consistent with a prevalent but mistaken liar stereotype. In a survey of more than 2,500 people in 63 countries, about 70% of respondents believed that when lying, people tend to avert their gaze, squirm, touch themselves more, and stutter. In experiments using actual interrogation training videos, training does not improve the ability to detect lies. It does, however, make people more confident about their judgments and causes them to list more reasons for their judgments. In studies where police officers watch video clips of real-life police interrogations and make judgments about deception, they do worse when they rely on the verbal and nonverbal cues emphasized in police training. Given their training, it may not be surprising that police investigators estimated that they can detect lies with a 77% accuracy, an estimate that exceeds their actual accuracy rates by about 25 percentage points. This overconfidence is consequential because interrogators sometimes wrongly but fervently believe a suspect is guilty merely because of his or her suspicious nonverbal behavior. during their initial interaction. Because interrogators falsely assume that the suspect is behaving in ways that indicate guilt, they may subject an innocent suspect to a high-pressure, psychologically coercive interrogation. Then, if that suspect confesses, interrogators may view the confession as confirming their initial presumption of guilt and as justifying the use of questionable interrogation tactics. Flawed interpretation of a suspect's verbal and nonverbal behavior is likely to fuel a phenomenon psychologists refer to as confirmation bias. Scores of research studies demonstrate that once we form a strong belief about someone, we tend to both seek out information that confirms that belief and to dismiss information that contradicts it. If an interrogator believes a suspect is guilty, the confirmation bias may be triggered. He or she will be prone to interpreting the suspect's behavior, particularly ambiguous behavior such as nervous fidgeting, gaze, and anxious facial expressions, as further evidence of deception and guilt. As research on wrongful convictions indicates, police sometimes misperceive innocent suspects as guilty because the suspect did not behave the right way when questioned. In light of the research, interrogators need to be taught that they cannot reliably intuit whether a suspect is innocent or guilty based on their hunches about the meaning of a suspect's suspicious demeanor. When faulty cues to deception are combined with the confirmation bias, police officers may put enormous pressure on innocent suspects, and some will falsely confess. I have included a link to a TED Talk about how to spot a liar. If you are interested, it is a 5-minute video that gives advice on how to spot lies. As you can see from the video, most of the talk relies on some of the faulty evidence we just discussed. It is pretty common for people to tout their abilities to detect lies as greater than we know to be true. Regardless, it is an entertaining video if you have some time to watch it. One of the problems with polygraphs is its susceptibility to countermeasures used by examinees to fool the machine and the examiner. Countermeasures can be physical or psychological. The most common countermeasures utilized are either pain or muscle tension. For example, in an effort to deceive the polygrapher, biting one's lip or tongue or subtly jabbing oneself with a pin may induce enough pain to promote a physiological response that masks the subject's response to questions from the polygrapher. Mental countermeasures include deliberate attempts at distortion using techniques such as counting backwards from 100 or thinking of a peaceful or arousing scene. In this way, the examinee tries to either minimize or maximize the emotional impact of questions. Although physical countermeasures can often be detected by experienced polygraphers, mental countermeasures are far more difficult to detect. Overall, it is generally recognized that there is no physiological response that is uniquely associated with lying. The United States Supreme Court case of U.S. v. Schaefer in 1998, where in an 8-1 decision, the court emphasized the poor reliability of polygraph evidence as a whole. Justice Thomas, writing for the majority, stressed that a fundamental premise of the criminal justice system is that jurors are the ultimate and most reliable evaluators of credibility and truthfulness. Since 1998, almost all courts reject polygraph results or only allow them if their admissibility is stipulated by both parties prior to the polygraph examination taking place. Only a few courts leave their admissibility up to the judge. But how do jurors respond to polygraph evidence? When juries are permitted to hear about the results of polygraph tests, it appears that they generally find the results persuasive. Consider the case of Buzz Fay. Fay was released from prison after serving 2 years of a life sentence. He was sent to prison for aggravated murder, convicted of shooting Fred Erie during the robbery of a liquor store. After being shot, Mr. Erie was rushed to the hospital, given pain medication, and while still conscious, asked about who shot him. While suffering from loss of blood and dying in a hospital room, Mr. Erie first replied, "It looked like Buzz, but it couldn't have been." But later, just before death, he said, "Buzz did it." The police realized their case was weak. There was no physical evidence implicating Fay, only the contradictory testimony of a dying, sedated man. So they made Fay's attorney an offer. They would drop all charges if Fay passed a lie detector test. Of course, everyone would need to agree in advance that the results would be admissible in court. Because Fay was innocent, the offer seemed like a quick way to put the matter to rest. But Fay failed the test. Then he failed a second test. Fay was convicted by a jury and sent to prison primarily on the results of his polygraph test. This is not the only case in which the results of a lie detector appear to have changed the outcome of a criminal trial. Although there is little systematic research on how much weight jurors attach to polygraph evidence, the few studies available suggest that jurors take such evidence seriously. For example, in one study, mock jurors were presented with the case of a mentally disturbed defendant who had a history of confessing to crimes he did not commit. Even though testimony of psychiatrists indicated that the defendant was prone to false confessions, 52% of mock jurors voted to convict him of murder. However, when testimony about the results of a lie detector test showed that the defendant had lied about committing the crime, only 28% voted to convict. When the researchers added a statement by the judge that the polygraph was only 80% accurate, 40% voted not guilty. In another study, 20 law students who reviewed the relevant evidence found a defendant not guilty. They were later given an opportunity to change their verdict when provided with information that the polygraph is 99.5% accurate and that the defendant had failed the test. Given this additional information, 85% of the mock jurors changed their minds and voted guilty. Finally, survey research shows that experts in psychophysiology who are knowledgeable about polygraphing are far more skeptical about the results of polygraph testing than are members of the general public. Research on this topic is quite limited, and more research is clearly needed. What is clear is that several people have been sent to prison because of polygraph results, and that mock jurors can be influenced by the results of a lie detector test. Whether or not jurors are swayed by polygraph evidence is likely to depend on several factors. The first being how persuasive the polygrapher is when testifying in court. Second being the amount and persuasiveness of rebuttal testimony. Also, the strength of the other evidence, the sophistication of the jurors, and the instructions given by the judge. Recent advances in brain science have been applied to lie detection. Using fMRI, scientists have observed that the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex are slightly more active when subjects are lying. Brain researchers have also observed that different parts of the brain become active when rehearsed and spontaneous lies are told. Still, this technology is developing. Although the fMRI can take brain images about every 2 seconds, it is expensive, cumbersome, and requires a cooperative subject. The EEG, which can read neural activity in milliseconds, has also been used in detecting lies. While the fMRI is good at reading where the brain is active, the EEG is much better at reading when the brain is active. In the EEG, a skull cap with many electrodes is placed over the suspect's head, and then electrical patterns are collected when he or she experiences stimuli. Generally, the P300, which is an electrical activity that occurs approximately 300 milliseconds after a stimulus is encountered, is the wave pattern that is tracked when testing a suspect for deception. The P300 is more prominent when a person lies. Another recent technology used to detect lies is the high-definition infrared thermal imaging technique. This technology picks up on tiny changes in the heat of a human face. Once again, the underlying theory is that physiological changes, specifically an increase in the heat around a suspect's eyes, accompany lying. Eye movements and pupil dilation have also been tracked while a suspect views a crime scene. And the laser Doppler vibrometer may, in time, be able to see physiological changes in a suspect from a distance by means of an infrared light beam. Clearly, the technology to detect changes in physiological arousal exists, and though quite complicated, is accurate. However, the degree to which the physiological changes this technology records are indicative of lying as opposed to other types of cognitive processes has yet to be determined. Even though it is conceivable that more sensitive physiological measures will eventually permit us to tell when someone is lying, the enduring problem is that there appears to be no distinctive set of physiological responses exclusively associated with lying. There is no unique tone of voice, no distinctive rhythm to the heartbeat, no precise change in blood pressure, and no signature pattern of neural excitation in the brain. It may turn out to be impossible for technology to uncover the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.